Victoria Whitmore believed she could humiliate anyone who didn't belong in her world. But tonight, she was about to learn what true power looked like, and it wasn't wearing diamonds. The grand ballroom shimmered under towering crystal chandeliers, light dancing across polished marble floors as servers in white gloves moved like clockwork between tables of silk gowns and tailored tuxedos. Every detail curated to impress. Every guest carefully selected. And then Naomi Carter walked in, her heels soft against the marble, her dress simple, elegant but unassuming, the kind that didn't beg for attention yet somehow drew it anyway. Conversations didn't stop, but they shifted. Glances lingered a second too long, subtle enough to deny but sharp enough to feel. Because in a room where status was everything, Naomi didn't fit the script, and people noticed across the room. Victoria Whitmore stood like royalty among her circle, her silver gown catching the light with every calculated movement. Her posture perfect, her smile practiced, the kind that never quite reached her eyes. And when those eyes landed on Naomi, they paused, narrowed, assessed, because Victoria had spent decades mastering one skill above all others, deciding who mattered and who didn't within seconds. She leaned slightly toward the woman beside her, her voice low but precise. Some invitations must have been misprinted. A soft ripple of laughter followed, controlled, polite, but laced with something colder, something sharper. And just like that, the room began to tilt against Naomi without a single direct word spoken to her, because exclusion at this level didn't need volume. It needed agreement. Naomi felt it. Of course she did. The shift in energy, the way eyes measured her, the way conversations subtly closed as she approached, but her expression didn't change, her steps didn't falter. She moved through the room with a quiet steadiness that didn't ask for approval and didn't expect it either. And that, more than anything, unsettled people. Victoria watched closely now, intrigued despite herself, because most people either shrank or overcompensated under pressure like this, but Naomi did neither. She simply existed, calm, composed, almost as if she understood something no one else did. And that silence, that quiet confidence, felt out of place in a room built on performance. Victoria's smile tightened just slightly, a decision forming behind her eyes, because control, once challenged, demanded correction, and she had no intention of letting an unknown woman disrupt the order of her carefully curated world. Not tonight, not in her room, not under her watch. And as she began to move toward Naomi, heels echoing softly against marble, there was a subtle shift in the air, like the calm before something irreversible, though no one in that room, not even Victoria herself, realized that the moment she chose to speak would be the exact moment everything began to unravel. Victoria stopped just a few feet from Naomi, her presence commanding enough to draw the attention of those nearby, without a single raised voice. The subtle hush spreading outward like ripples in water as conversation slowed and eyes turned, because when Victoria Whitmore moved, people noticed, and when she chose a target, they watched. She tilted her head slightly, her smile polite but sharpened at the edges. "I do not believe we have met," she said, her tone carrying the kind of practiced courtesy that masked judgment rather than softened it. Naomi turned to face her fully now, calm, steady, her expression unreadable. "No, we have not," she replied, her voice even, unhurried, and for a brief second, that lack of reaction unsettled Victoria more than defiance ever could. Victoria's gaze moved deliberately from Naomi's simple dress to her understated jewelry, cataloging every detail, confirming her conclusion. "This event is quite exclusive," she continued, her voice lowering just enough to feel intimate while still being overheard, usually reserved for individuals who are directly connected to the foundation. A pause, slight but intentional, allowing the implication to settle, the surrounding guests leaning in without appearing to do so, drawn to the quiet tension building between them. Naomi held her ground, her hands relaxed at her sides, her posture neither defensive nor apologetic, simply present. "I understand," she said softly, and that was all. No explanation, no justification, nothing to satisfy the expectation that she should defend her right to exist in that space. And the silence that followed stretched longer than anyone anticipated. Victoria's smile tightened again, a flicker of irritation breaking through her polished composure, because she was used to control, to immediate submission or eager clarification, not this quiet refusal to engage on her terms. Then perhaps, "There has been a misunderstanding," she added, her tone now edged with authority. "Security has been instructed to ensure that only verified guests remain." As if summoned by the suggestion alone, a suited staff member at the edge of the room shifted his stance, his attention now clearly fixed on Naomi. A few guests exchanged glances, some curious, others already convinced of the outcome, because in rooms like this, perception often moved faster than truth. Naomi noticed the movement, of course. She did, but her expression did not change. Instead, she lifted her gaze slightly, meeting Victoria's eyes with a calm that felt almost deliberate, almost knowing, and that calm began to ripple outward in a different way, subtle but undeniable, creating a quiet tension that did not belong to Victoria anymore. For a brief moment, something unspoken passed between them, something that made Victoria hesitate, just barely, as if she sensed that she was stepping into something she did not fully understand. But the moment passed as quickly as it came, replaced by the confidence of someone who had never been challenged in a room like this. And as she gave the slightest nod toward the approaching staff member, believing she was about to restore order, the atmosphere shifted again, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough that a few people closer to the entrance began to turn their heads, as if something unseen had just entered the room, and Naomi, standing perfectly still in the center of it all, did not look surprised at all. The staff member took another step forward, his polished shoes barely making a sound against the marble floor, but the weight of his presence was enough to draw a wider circle of attention as nearby conversations faded into a low murmur, the kind that carried curiosity more than concern, because moments like this were rare but familiar in rooms built on status. Victoria straightened slightly, her confidence returning as she watched the scene unfold exactly as she expected, her expression composed, almost gracious now, as if she were simply maintaining standards rather than enforcing them. And yet there was a flicker of something else beneath it, a need to reaffirm control in front of the audience that mattered. "Ma'am," the staff member began, his tone respectful but firm as he addressed Naomi. "May I see your invitation?" His words carefully chosen, professional, but unmistakably aligned with the direction Victoria had set, and for a brief second, all eyes shifted fully to Naomi, waiting, measuring, predicting the outcome before it even arrived. Naomi did not reach for a purse or a phone. She did not search for proof or offer explanation. Instead, she looked at him with the same calm steadiness she had carried since the moment she entered, and in that stillness, something subtle changed, not loud enough to name, but strong enough to feel, like a quiet resistance that did not need to announce itself. "You may," she said gently, her voice even, almost soft, yet it carried clearly in the hush that had settled around them. But she did not move, she did not produce anything, and the pause that followed stretched just long enough to create uncertainty where certainty had been expected. Victoria's eyes narrowed slightly, impatience now threading through her composure, because hesitation was not part of the script, and uncertainty, even the smallest hint of it, was something she had spent years eliminating from her environment. A few guests exchanged glances, their earlier confidence beginning to waver, not because they doubted Victoria, but because Naomi's stillness did not match the role she had been assigned. And in rooms like this, when someone refused to play their part, it disrupted more than just a moment. It unsettled the entire narrative. The staff member shifted his weight, caught between instruction and instinct, as if he too sensed that something about this situation did not align as neatly as it should. And just as he was about to speak again, the distant sound of doors opening carried across the ballroom, subtle but distinct, followed by a change in movement near the entrance as several heads turned almost in unison, drawn not by noise, but by presence. And Naomi, standing exactly where she had been all along, finally allowed the faintest hint of a smile to touch her lips, not triumphant, not defensive, just knowing, as if the moment everyone thought they understood was only now beginning to reveal what it truly was. The words had barely settled when the shift became undeniable, not in volume, but in gravity, as if the center of the room had quietly moved, and taken everyone's certainty with it. And the man standing beside Naomi did not rush to speak. He did not announce titles or credentials. Instead, he reached into the inside pocket of his tailored jacket and handed a small, understated card to the staff member who had approached moments earlier, the kind of card that did not need decoration because its meaning was already understood. The staff member glanced down, his posture changing instantly, not dramatically, but enough to reveal recognition, his shoulders straightening, his tone softening as he stepped back half a pace, no longer questioning, no longer leading, simply acknowledging. "Of course, Ms. Carter," he said, his voice now carrying a respect that had not been there before. And that single shift echoed louder than any announcement could. A quiet ripple moved outward as those closest began to notice, eyes narrowing slightly, conversations pausing mid-sentence as the realization started to form, not fully clear yet, but enough to unsettle what had been assumed. Victoria watched closely, her expression tightening, trying to piece together what she was seeing, because the scene no longer followed the pattern she understood. The roles had shifted without explanation, and for the first time, she did not have the information she needed to stay in control. Naomi remained still, her posture unchanged, as if none of this required effort, as if she had simply allowed the moment to arrive rather than force it. And that calm now carried something sharper, something that made the room lean in without realizing it. The man beside her spoke quietly, but his words carried just far enough. "Everything is prepared," he said, not to the room, not even to Victoria, but directly to Naomi, and that distinction mattered, because it placed her not as a guest, not as an exception, but as the one being waited on, the one being deferred to. A few guests exchanged glances now, subtle but unmistakable, the kind that said something had been missed, something important, and the confidence that had once filled the room began to thin, replaced by a cautious awareness that they might have been standing on the wrong side of the moment all along. Victoria's smile faded completely now, not replaced by anger, but by calculation, her mind searching for footing, for a way to re-enter a narrative that had already begun to move without her. And yet the more she watched, the clearer it became that this was not a situation she could redirect, because it was never hers to control. Naomi finally shifted her gaze, not toward the crowd, but toward the front of the room where the stage waited, untouched, prepared, and for the first time since she entered, she took a step forward, quiet, deliberate, and in that single movement, the room understood something it had not been told, that this night, this carefully constructed event, had never been about who appeared to belong, but about who had been in control from the very beginning. The silence did not break immediately. It deepened, stretching across the ballroom like a held breath, as every pair of eyes remained fixed on Naomi, no longer questioning whether she belonged, but trying to understand how they had misjudged her so completely. Victoria's posture, once effortless and commanding, now carried a stiffness she could not disguise, her mind racing to recover footing, to reframe what was happening into something she could still control, but the certainty she had relied on was slipping, piece by piece. The man beside Naomi stepped slightly back, not retreating, but repositioning himself with quiet deference, making space rather than taking it, a gesture that did not go unnoticed, because in a room defined by hierarchy, respect revealed more than titles ever could. Naomi finally shifted her gaze across the room, not hurried, not dramatic, but deliberate, taking in the faces that had moments ago dismissed her without a word, and there was no anger in her expression, no need for it. Only a calm clarity that carried more weight than any confrontation. "We can begin," she said, her voice steady, not raised. Yet it carried effortlessly through the stillness, and as if responding to a signal only now understood, the lighting softened slightly. The musicians near the stage adjusted, and the master of ceremonies, who had been waiting at the edge of the room, straightened with sudden awareness, checking his notes as if they had just become real. A quiet ripple of realization moved through the guests, subtle at first, then unmistakable. As fragments of understanding began to connect, the donor list, the last-minute changes, the unusually quiet anticipation that had surrounded the event, all pointing towards something far larger than they had assumed, something that had been orchestrated with precision long before anyone had stepped into the room. Victoria's lips parted slightly, as if to speak, to reclaim control with a carefully crafted sentence, but nothing came. Because every version of the moment she had prepared for no longer applied, and the woman she had dismissed now stood at the center of it all without needing to declare it. Naomi's attention returned briefly to Victoria, not with triumph, not with accusation, but with a quiet acknowledgement that felt more final than any confrontation. And in that look, Victoria understood not just who Naomi was, but what she herself had revealed in the process. Around them, the room began to move again, but differently now. Conversations resumed in softer tones. Glances carried respect instead of judgment, and the staff who had once hesitated now moved with clear direction, aligning themselves with a presence they recognized without needing explanation. Naomi took a single step forward, subtle yet decisive, and in that moment, it became clear that the evening was never meant to be controlled by appearances, but by something far less visible and far more powerful, something that could not be announced, only revealed, and the realization settled over the room like a quiet truth no one could ignore. The shift in the room was no longer subtle. It was undeniable, like a current that had changed direction and taken everyone with it. And now every movement, every glance, every quiet whisper seemed to orbit around Naomi in a way that could not be reversed. The master of ceremonies stepped forward with renewed purpose, his earlier hesitation replaced by a tone of respect that carried clearly across the ballroom as he adjusted the microphone and began to speak, his voice steady but edged with something new. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience," he said, his eyes briefly flicking toward Naomi before continuing. "We are honored to officially begin this evening under the direction of someone whose vision made this entire event possible." And just like that, the final layer of uncertainty dissolved, replaced by a clarity that settled heavily over the crowd. A ripple of quiet realization moved from table to table as guests straightened in their seats, their expressions shifting from curiosity to recognition, because the narrative they had unconsciously built was now collapsing in real time, replaced by one far more significant, one that had been present all along but hidden beneath assumptions. Victoria stood motionless, her gaze fixed on Naomi, no longer with judgment, but with something far more complex, something that blended disbelief with the slow, unavoidable acceptance of truth. And for the first time that evening, she did not speak, because there was nothing left to assert, nothing left to control. Naomi did not move toward the stage immediately. She did not rush to claim attention or correct the room. Instead, she allowed the moment to settle fully, giving space for understanding to arrive on its own. And when she finally stepped forward, it was with the same quiet composure she had carried from the beginning, each step measured, unhurried. The soft echo of her heels against the marble, now carrying a different meaning entirely. As she passed by Victoria, there was a brief pause, just long enough to acknowledge the moment without turning it into spectacle. Naomi's gaze meeting hers for a second, calm, steady, not seeking validation, not offering condemnation, simply reflecting a truth that no longer needed explanation. And Victoria, who had once commanded the room with effortless authority, found herself unable to hold that gaze for more than a heartbeat before looking away. The room followed Naomi now, not out of obligation, but because something deeper had shifted, something that redefined who held presence and why. And as she reached the front, the light catching softly against her simple dress, it became clear to everyone watching that influence did not always arrive loudly, that power did not always announce itself, and that the most defining moments were often the ones that revealed, rather than declared, exactly who had been in control all along. Naomi stood beneath the soft glow of the chandeliers, letting the silence stretch just long enough for every assumption in the room to rise to the surface and face itself. And when she finally spoke, her voice was calm but carried a quiet edge that had not been there before. 5 years ago, this foundation started with people who believed impact should be measured by what you give, not what you wear, she said, her eyes sweeping across the crowd, steady, unflinching, and tonight proved something else. A brief pause, just enough to tighten the air. How quickly people decide who matters. The words landed differently now, sharper, not loud but undeniable. and a subtle discomfort moved through the room as guests shifted in place. No longer spectators, but participants in what had just unfolded. Naomi took a slow step forward, her heels echoing softly against the marble, each sound now carrying weight. "You saw a dress," she continued, her gaze briefly passing over Victoria, without lingering, "and assumed a story." Another pause, quieter this time. "But you never asked who built the room you're standing in." The sentence settled like a final piece falling into place, and this time the silence was heavier, deeper, because there was nothing left to misunderstand. Across the room, Victoria's composure cracked in a way no one had ever seen before. Not dramatic, not loud, but unmistakable, her lips parting slightly as if to respond, to correct, to reclaim something. But there was nothing to reach for, because the moment had already moved past her. Naomi did not raise her voice, did not demand attention. Yet every person in that ballroom leaned into her presence as if pulled by something stronger than status. "Respect is not something you assign based on appearance," she said quietly. "It reveals itself in how you treat people when you think they have nothing to offer." And now the weight shifted fully, not onto her, but onto them, onto the room, onto every glance that had come before. She let the silence sit again, longer this time, unbroken, until it became impossible to ignore, and then, with the slightest exhale, she stepped back, not claiming the spotlight, but releasing it, because she never needed it to begin with. And in that moment, it was clear that power had never been about control, it had been about presence all along. The room did not erupt into applause, it did not rush to recover. Instead it remained still, held in a rare kind of silence that no one dared interrupt. Because what had just been revealed was not performance, it was truth. And truth has a way of quieting even the loudest spaces. Victoria stood frozen, her earlier authority now replaced by something far more exposed. Her gaze fixed on Naomi with a realization that arrived too late to change anything. And for the first time, she understood that. The moment she had tried to define someone else, she had unknowingly defined herself. A few guests lowered their eyes. Others adjusted their posture. Subtle shifts that spoke louder than words, because the room had changed, not through force, but through recognition. And that kind of change could not be undone. Naomi turned slightly, acknowledging the man who had stepped forward earlier. But this time there was no need for confirmation, no need for explanation. Everything that mattered had already been made clear, and as the evening slowly began to move again, it did so differently, quieter, more aware, as if everyone present understood they were no longer just attending an event. They were part of something they had almost misunderstood entirely. Victoria finally took a step forward, hesitant, measured, as if considering words she was no longer certain she had the right to say. But Naomi did not wait for them. She simply met her eyes one last time, calm, steady, leaving no space for performance, only truth, and then turned away. Not in dismissal, but in completion, because nothing more needed to be said. The music resumed softly, glasses lifted again, conversations returned, but beneath it all lingered something deeper, something that would stay long after the night ended. And as Naomi moved through the room once more, no longer unnoticed, no longer questioned, it became clear that what people had witnessed was not just a revelation of identity, but a reminder of something far more powerful, something